This week on the West Block, the standoff in Nova Scotia.
The rights of Indigenous lobster harvesters to fish outside the commercial season. The violence is unfolding despite weeks of negotiations.
These unacceptable acts of violence cannot and will not fetter the right of the Mi'kmaq people to pursue a moderate livelihood.
National Chief Bellegarde on how to end systemic racism in the healthcare system.
Before you transfer these billions of dollars, that there should be a very concrete action plan in place on how to deal with this so that this no longer happens again.
Businesses ordered to shut their doors once again.
That means no indoor dining at restaurants and bars. Gyms, casinos, and movie theaters will be closed.
This was one of the toughest decisions I ever had to make as Premier, because even though it will help us prevent another full-scale lockdown, I know what this will do to businesses.
We're likely to see so many boarded up locations across the country before the end of this.
Hello, it's Sunday, October 18th. I'm Mercedes Stephenson, and this is the West Block. Police say a man is in hospital following the massive fire that completely destroyed a lobster pound being used by Mi'kmaq fishermen in Nova Scotia. This follows heated tensions and a week of violence directed against Indigenous lobster fishermen. The RCMP is sending in additional officers to keep the peace. To discuss all this, I'm joined by Public Safety Minister Bill Blair. Minister Blair, welcome to the show and thank you for joining us this morning.
Good morning, Mercedes.
Minister Blair, looking at what's happening in Nova Scotia, some, including NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, have said that this is terrorism. Do you agree with that assessment?
What is very clear that there has been acts of criminality there. There's been vandalism, arson, violence, and assaults that have taken place, and that's completely unacceptable. There's a very complicated issue being resolved there, and people are working very hard at fisheries and Indigenous affairs and within the community to resolve it as fairly and quickly as possible. But these acts of criminality are completely unacceptable, and that's why we've taken steps to make sure that there's enough police resources in the area to preserve the peace while that important work goes on.
Speaking of the police, have you been satisfied with the RCMP's response on this? Because First Nations leaders have been saying the RCMP essentially stood by and watched this happen. They didn't intervene. It's been clear that this was escalating for weeks. And when they were questioned about that, the RCMP said that essentially journalists shouldn't be making this, the police, the issue here. So are you satisfied with the RCMP's performance as the public safety minister?
Well, first of all, Mercedes, I have some sympathy for how difficult the job of the police is in these circumstances. But I think it's also critical that they be effective in the ground, that they do take every step necessary to prevent acts of violence and criminality, to keep people safe, to preserve the peace while this work is going on. And although I recognize it's a very difficult job, I was concerned that they required more resources. And I've had conversations with Nova Scotia Attorney General, who spoke to the police commander, the RCMP commander in Nova Scotia. I spoke to the commissioner. We've taken the steps necessary to ensure that the resources necessary to keep people safe and to preserve the peace are available on the ground. I have regularly briefed on the work that's going on there. I think it's important that the peace be kept, and the RCMP, have a tough job to do, but they have to do it well. And their communications with all of the people involved in this incident have to be clear that criminal acts and violence will not be tolerated, and that action will be taken. And I have been pleased to see just in the past few days that as a result of their work and the investigations that they've undertaken, evidence has been gathered, charges have now been laid. I think if people realize if they're going to engage in this types of criminality, that they're going to get caught and there are going to be real consequences, that's likely to be an effective deterrent. And if it's not, we will make sure that we have the resources there to do everything possible to keep the peace, to prevent crime, and where it does take place, to respond to it quickly and appropriately.
But with all due respect, Minister, why did the RCMP not intervene sooner? Why did your government not intervene sooner in what was clearly an escalating dispute that was heading towards violence?
Well, let me be really clear that the police have been on scene right from the outset in significant numbers, but
on scene,
some of the
but
disputes that took
obviously
place,
not taking action in some cases, or at least that's the allegations.
And well, I appreciate the allegations, but if you look at the actual circumstances where you know a few hundred people came into conflict, and the officers on the ground, you know, utilizing their authorities and their limited resources to try to separate the combatants, but they also gathered evidence there were acts of criminality that took place there, and the police have done their job of laying the charges. In large crowd events like that, sometimes it's very difficult to prevent every altercation and act of violence that can take place. The police have, as I said, have got a tough job to do. We want to make sure that they have the resources necessary to do the job. You know, the RCMP are they're among the finest police services in the world. The officers down there know that they have a very difficult job to do, and they're doing what is necessary. But we want to ensure that they have the resources to be effective. And I want to call upon everybody who, I think the resolution of Indigenous fishing rights for the Mi'kmaq people in Nova Scotia and throughout Atlantic Canada is important. That work is ongoing. The Marshall decision is clear, and we are working hard to resolve that as quickly and as appropriately as possible. And at the same time, I recognize the concern that others may have, but I want to be very clear. Acts of criminality, violence, it will not be tolerated, cannot be tolerated, and in fact, it is to the detriment of everyone's interest that take place. So I would ask everybody, calm down. Let DFO, let the negotiators do their work. We'll keep people informed. We'll keep the peace, and I just hope that people will allow that work to proceed.
Minister Blair, turning our attention south to the United States, President Trump has been raising questions about the legitimacy of the U.S. election. A lot of folks concerned about what will happen if there is a dispute over who the legitimate president is or if somebody refuses to leave office. Are you concerned about national security implications for Canada based on the potential chaos that could follow the U.S. election?
Well, Mercedes, first of all, I actually have some confidence in America and in their courts and in their officials to maintain the peace. But we'll always be prepared and take whatever steps are necessary to secure Canada's interests. We'll make sure that the integrity of our borders are maintained and that we work very closely with American officials. But we will always be prepared to do whatever is necessary to keep Canadians safe. But I actually have some confidence in our neighbors to the south. I know they're going through a difficult time. We watch carefully, but we're anxious and hopeful that they'll be able to resolve it peaceably.
We just have a few moments left, but there seem to be conflicting narratives between the Trump administration and the Canadian government about whether we are looking at reopening the border soon. What's your response?
The border will remain closed as long as it's in the interest and health and safety of Canadians to keep it closed. We've been very effective in establishing border restrictions that allowed the movement of trade and essential goods and essential workers across that border. And so I think it has been very effective until circumstances change substantively that would make it less risky. We'll maintain those border closures, and I believe that that's the Americans' interest as well. We're also working very closely with the provinces and territories. We analyze the data every day, but right now, I believe it's in the best interest of Canadians to maintain those restrictions for the foreseeable future.
Okay, Minister Blair, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Mercedes.
Up next, we'll speak with National Chief Perry Bellegarde about the tensions in Nova Scotia and racism in the healthcare system. Last week, the federal government met with Indigenous leaders to discuss disturbing accounts of racism within Canada's healthcare system. Those conversations were happening at the same time as escalating tensions on the East Coast and concerns about violence against Mi'kmaq fishermen in Nova Scotia. Joining me now to discuss this is Assembly of First Nations National Chief Perry Bellegarde. Good morning, Chief Bellegarde, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for the opportunity to be here, Mercedes.
You had an opportunity to meet with some of the Indigenous and political leadership in Canada on Friday, talking about discrimination in the Canadian healthcare system. This, of course, comes after that shocking video that was just before the death of Joyce Estraquan, how she was treated in a hospital in Quebec. It has led to calls for an inquiry, calls for criminal charges, calls for accountability in the healthcare system. What came of that meeting, and are you satisfied that there is a plan to address the kind of racism that we're seeing in the healthcare system?
Well, first off, we'll lift up the ministers of the Crown, the federal government that called for this meeting on Friday to talk about and listen, basically to bear witness to a lot of First Nations and Métis and Inuit doctors that are working in a healthcare system. And so we listened and we heard their stories. But we also listened to the husband of Joyce Echaquan, and we heard his story as well, and the pain that he feels now that his wife has passed on. So nobody in this country can deny that there's systemic racism or systemic discrimination in the healthcare system. It's a fact and it's real. The question now is, what are we going to do about it? So we listened all day on Friday to testimonies and everything else, experiences from basically what Joyce Echaquan experienced in Quebec to Mr. Sinclair, who died in waiting for health services in Winnipeg Hospital, to the guessing game in BC between the doctors and the nurses trying to guess the alcohol content of a First Nations person. So there is so many examples given. Now everybody's starting to focus on what are the answers, what are the solutions. So everything from looking at an ombudsperson so that there is a place to go with these stories, looking at more accountability in the system, getting more First Nations nurses and doctors into the system, into positions of authority, even looking at transfers to the provinces, that even the talk about looking at before these healthcare monies are transferred to the provinces and territorial governments, that they have a plan on how to deal with systemic discrimination in the healthcare system. And so that was talked about, and there was another date picked in January to come back with some real concrete recommendations how to deal with this systemic racism in the healthcare system.
What is your position on the transfers to the provinces? Because as you were mentioning there, some Indigenous Canadians believe that the federal government should refuse to make those transfers or should make them contingent on the provinces actually having a plan to deal with racism against Indigenous Canadians in their healthcare system.
Well, anything that you can use to put pressure on the provincial and territorial governments to have a plan in place should be looked at. And so you got to look at the whole Canadian transfer, health transfer agreement, the CHTA, and that has to be looked at. And whether it requires policy or legislative change to make that a requirement, that's one of the tools that you should look at in the toolbox. Because again, the provincial governments will say healthcare is a provincial jurisdiction. Well, a lot of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people access that healthcare system, but right now they're just not getting the proper services and treatment. And so that's very real. And so we have to look at every avenue, every tool we can to bring about systemic change into a system that really is systemic racism and discrimination against First Nations people. So that's one of the tools. Like before you transfer these billions of dollars, that there should be a very concrete action plan in place on how to deal with this so that this no longer happens again. It's 2020, for goodness sake. We all need to have good quality health care, every one of us, from coast to coast to coast.
I want to turn our attention as well to what's happening with the Mi'kmaq fishermen in Nova Scotia and this escalating violence and tension. Have you been satisfied with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's response on this?
Well, it's moving in the right way, Mercedes. This is a long-standing issue. You've got a recent Supreme Court decision 21 years ago, the Marshall decision, which is the highest court of this land that recognized the Mi'kmaq fisher people's right to fish. You know, it's an inherent right. It's a treaty right. It's contained in Section 35 of Canada's Constitution, which recognizes existing Aboriginal treaty rights. So the implementation of that right has to be moving into the right way. And so Chief Michael Sack, under his own jurisdiction, has issued licenses and permits. So it's a lawfully regulated fishery. And so there's two things that have to happen on the East Coast right now. One, we have to make sure that there's calm heads and cooler heads come together so that there's peace on the ground. And that's where we call on the Royal Canadian Mounted Police to do their job. Because we witnessed a van that was burned, no charges. We seen a physical assault on Chief Michael Sack, no charges. 2 people were barricaded in a building against their will, no charges. This is not acceptable. So there's an issue of public safety that must be addressed immediately. Then the next issue would be a process to work with the Mi'kmaq Nation to define what moderate livelihood means. And again, this is not a conservation issue because the Mi'kmaq fishery accesses 1% of the total lobster fishery out on the East Coast. So it's more in the sense of how does everybody start working together to peacefully coexist and everybody benefit from that resource that's there. So defining that moderate livelihood is the next big step going forward. And that's where DFO comes into play, Department of Fisheries notion, to start working with the leadership in that territory.
National Chief Bellegarde, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks again for the opportunity, Mercedes.
Up next, the Minister for Small Business joins us on what Ottawa is doing to try to help businesses get through this next wave of COVID-19 shutdowns. This week, Canada saw the highest daily case count since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. As cases climb and the second wave comes into full swing across the country, certain businesses have been forced to close their doors once again. We spoke with Dan Kelly, president of the Canadian Federation of Independent Business. He says the second wave may mean many Canadian small businesses will be forced to shut their doors permanently, especially those who barely survived the first wave. Here's some of what he had to say.
Our expected number of business losses as a result of COVID wave 1 was 160,000 permanent business failures directly attributable to the pandemic. With the prospect of a second wave, with further business shutdowns and with the messages to consumers to stay home once again in large chunks of Canada, one can expect that that number could even be higher.
Joining me now is Minister of Small Business, Export and Promotion and International Trade, Mary Ng. Thank you so much for joining us, Minister. We hope that you and your family are well. We just heard from Dan Kelly there. You know, he was telling us here at the West Block that he really feels you and Minister Freeland have been listening. He did not feel that the previous finance minister, Mr. Morneau, did the same. You've made a lot of changes to programs, but there's still an awful lot of concern and worry out there from small businesses who've been told you must shut down because of this second wave of COVID-19. They're saying, I've done everything right. I've been careful. Why do I have to shut down? I may not survive. What is your message to them as the minister today?
Well, Mercedes, thank you so much, and all the best to you and your family as well for good health and staying safe. What I would say to those businesses is precisely why we have introduced the supports that we have for businesses. I'll point out the rent subsidy in particular. We know that businesses are experiencing revenue loss, have experienced revenue loss. So that is why we've introduced the rent subsidy, and there an additional 25% to help with that fixed cost should the business have to experience a shutdown as a result of a health order. This is, it is difficult. It's been absolutely difficult for businesses all across the country, and it is that very balance that we all as Canadians have had to deal with, which is fighting this COVID-19. Introducing that additional support for those businesses that may have to shut down due to a health because of COVID-19.
And businesses certainly acknowledging that your government has made adjustments to the programs and not just minor tweaks, but some pretty major changes that make them more accessible and better for businesses. But there's still a gap between the old programs and the new. There's a few weeks where businesses won't qualify. Some are saying, I have to pay my rent in those weeks. I can't manage to pay my bills. Why was it that the government didn't launch these new improved programs sooner with all the scientific projections, about a second wave?
We've been listening to businesses and working with them all along. And I would point out that our programs are a suite of programs. So what we heard clearly from businesses, really important for businesses to keep their people even when their revenues are not back as they would be pre-COVID-19. So that's where the wage subsidy comes in. And of course, we're extending that all the way until the summer of 2021. The same thing with respect to the rent subsidy. We're going to extend that until the summer of 2021. And the additional CEBA loan that we're just adding another 20,000 to, where 10,000 of that 20 would be forgivable if you're able to pay it back in 2022. So it's a suite of programs to deal with keeping your people, dealing with those fixed costs, and to have a bit of that working capital, all working together so that we can help businesses through this difficult time, because it is difficult. And we've said,
I think the question from these businesses is, why weren't these programs available earlier? Why is there a gap if we knew that this was potentially coming and there was likely to be more shutdowns?
Well, what we're doing here in the rent subsidy, I think that's the one you're talking about. That program, the previous program, concluded in September. But I also want to reassure businesses that the new rent subsidy will be available to businesses backdated to September. So their eligibility will absolutely get them that coverage for September. It's also why we introduce additional liquidity through CEBA. So it is that complementarity of the programs that is out there to help our businesses. And of course, wage subsidy continues, and we're continuing that at its current levels until December, and the program overall will be available until the end of next summer.
There's been some concern about what big retailers are doing in Canada. I'm thinking about big multinational corporations like Amazon or Walmart, that they're facing increased costs, and some small businesses are saying, look, they're trying to pass this cost on to us. They're telling us we have to get our rates down. We are already barely within our margins. Is the government looking to do something to address how these massive international businesses are allegedly treating small Canadian businesses that are already struggling?
Well, our work always will and continues to be helping our small businesses. I want to point out a really terrific program called Canada United, which we partnered with the Chamber of Commerce on, and this is really about promoting buy local. I think you can look forward to seeing more of that. It's taken Team Canada to flatten this curve. It's taken Team Canada and communities all around the country to help support those local, incredible businesses. I've seen businesses do incredible pivots right now, utilizing e-commerce and digital so that they are continuing to manage through COVID. And whether it's the new ideas or the new pivots that are coming, or helping businesses bridge through this important period, we are going to be there. We're going to continue to be there. We've said all the way along, we've got your back. We're going to manage and fight COVID-19 and at the same time support our businesses so that they can bridge themselves so that we can get to the other side of COVID-19. That is our commitment, and I continue to work hard. Our government continues to work hard. I'll listen to businesses, and we're going to do whatever it takes to help our businesses get through this from coast to coast to coast.
Minister Ng, late last week, the Chinese ambassador to Canada made a comment about Canada's decision to allow Hong Kong activists, freedom activists, to come here. And a lot of folks are interpreting this as basically a thinly veiled threat. Are you concerned that China is about to retaliate against Canadian businesses, given Canada's decision to allow those in Hong Kong who are fighting for freedom to come here?
Well, my colleague, Minister Champagne, has already spoken on this about those remarks being inappropriate, and that Canada will always stand up for Canadians, no matter where they are in the world, and Canada will always stand up for human rights. With respect to Canadian businesses that operate anywhere in the globe, including in China, we will continue to stand up for Canadian businesses, work hard on their behalf, as we always have, our producers, our businesses, and that work will continue.
Minister Ng, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. And it's Small Business Week this week, starting tomorrow. So let's all get out there and support our Canadian businesses.
Thank you to you at home for joining us as well. The West Block will be right back here next week at the same time. Have a great weekend.